and 2 spring presentations. So following suit, we'll have 2 more presentations coming this fall. So stay tuned. I also want to point out that all of the presentations we host are recorded and can be accessed via the Office of Water Programs website. So today's presentation will be approximately 35 or 40 minutes long, so we should have about 20 minutes left for questions at the end. And we will go beyond 1 p.m. to answer questions if necessary. Please submit questions by emailing them to the email address currently showing on the screen. That's seminarquestions@owp.csus.edu. You can take a screenshot or also check the chat line where the email address is also provided. Okay, now for the important part, I want to welcome Jay Lund. Jay is going to share his thoughts on why California can't catch all this water during the wet winters. And of course, this is good timing, as we certainly had a heck of a wet season. Jay is Vice Director of the Center for Watershed Sciences and a distinguished professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Davis. In California, he was on the advisory committee for the 1998 and 2005 California Water Plan updates and has served as convener on the California Water and Environment Modeling Forum and chair of California's Delta Independent Science Board. He is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering. He has long been involved in applying economic and optimization ideas to provide insights on California's water problems, including the development and use of the Calvin model of California's water supply system. Jay has a bachelor's in international relations and regional planning from the University of Delaware and a bachelor's in civil engineering, master's in geography, and PhD in civil engineering from the University of Washington up in Seattle. He has advised over 150 graduate students, including 15 who are faculty at research universities globally, and has over 400 publications and reports. So with that, I'll hand it off to Jay.
Great. Face it, I'm old. That's what you learned from the introduction. Okay, can you see the screen correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Why California can't catch all the water in wet winters? So this is the situation this year, and it's the situation in actually most years where we have at least one storm where we can't catch it all. And in the aftermath of those storms, we're all having to hear the question, why can't we just capture all that water that's flowing out to sea? And so that's what this talk is about, with some context built around it. See if I get the slides to advance. There we go. So this is my favorite cartoon for water management. And it applies especially well to California water, where there's a lot of partial understanding of the system, even by experts. You know, imagine all the things that go on within our water systems between the precipitation and the water coming out of the tap and all the treatment and collection and storage and quality control and regulations and governance. Even the most expert person on California water doesn't know everything inside that box. So it's a big social activity as well as a very technical activity. We've been having some wild times in hydrology for California recently. This is a plot of the precipitation for many of the years recently and over the course of a water year from October 1st to the end of September. You can see right now we're in a pretty wet year, but not the wettest year on record for the Tulare Basin. And it's been a wet year, but not the wettest year of record most other places in California. And you can see how precipitation in California comes in big gulps, depending upon the number of storms we get and the frequency of the storms. This is also a wild place hydrologically. not only within the season, but between years. This is one of my favorite maps done by Mike Dettinger on the annual coefficient of variation for precipitation for all these thousands of stations across the United States. I'm originally from a very boring place in Delaware over here. Nobody knows anybody from Delaware anymore. And then as you move further west, you get more interannual variability. And then you get to California, particularly Southern California, which has incredibly high coefficient of variation between years. And how I like to explain this to people is to say that in California, we have more flood years and drought years per average year than any other state in the union. So we have both the highs and the lows, and we have a few averages, fewer averages than most. Most of you will understand something about the spatial and temporal distribution of water in California. We have a map on the left. Shows that we have about 2/3 of all the runoff in the state comes off about 20% of the surface area. About 90% of all the runoff in the state comes off of about 40% of the surface area of the state. These red areas are 30% of the surface area of California and produce 0.1% of the runoff. So we have deserts and we have some pretty wet areas. There's a silhouette of the state of Massachusetts, just for scale for anybody from the East Coast. This water is available not at the places we want it, because it tends to be far from the large agricultural and urban areas. And it's not at the times that we want it. It tends to be available in the wintertime when we would like it in the summer and the spring for irrigation of our lawns and of our crops. So we have a big mismatch in space and time for these. And so California has become a heaven for infrastructure engineers, water engineers, because we're always trying to move water in space and time. So to make that natural distribution of water better match what the humans want for it. So this map on the right shows the tremendous infrastructure system we have of reservoirs and groundwater basins and canals and pipelines and aqueducts. And one thing I really like about this map is it's color coded for the infrastructure's ownership. So you can see we have a tremendous mix of private and local governments and state and federal projects. It's a very colorful water management situation. In terms of, since this is a talk on water storage, here's a plot of the total amount of groundwater and surface water storage we have available in California, and how much of it we tend to use. So we have something on the order of about 150 million acre feet of groundwater storage capacity that's in principle accessible. You might have to deepen some wells to get to it, but it's accessible in a sense. We have about 42 million acre feet of surface storage capacities. And then of those, in an average year, seasonal storage, so to make up for an average year's wet and dry periods, we tend to draw more from the surface water than from the groundwater. Can you see my cursor when I move it around?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see the little green area, that's the seasonal storage in an average year. And then during droughts, we use a lot more of the surface water and a lot even more of the groundwater. So for normal average seasonal storage, we depend more on the surface water storage than the groundwater storage, although certainly we use a lot of groundwater seasonally. But in droughts, we're more reliant on groundwater than surface water. And the longer the drought, the less surface water we have for the later years of a drought, and we become more and more reliant on groundwater over time. And then just to be a little provocative, this third bar here shows the total amount of storage for all of the proposed surface water storage projects under, was it Proposition 2, I guess it was, which was about 4 million acre feet of storage. I just want to use this graph to demonstrate how even if we built everything that people are proposing for surface water storage, it doesn't really add all that much storage to California's water system. That's an important thing to realize in all of those debates. Here's another look at that infrastructure. You can see the map on the left is one you've seen before, and it shows where the 42 million acre foot of surface storage is. The map on the right, really, instead of taking a top-down view where you see the reservoirs on the surface, it's a bottom-up view. So if you're looking at California's water system from the center of the earth, you would see the huge groundwater basins before you ever saw the surface water reservoirs, and that would be appropriate in many ways because that's where most of the water storage is. So again, this idea that both surface water and groundwater storage are important, but by far the greatest capacity for storing water and water available in storage is in groundwater for the state. We certainly still have groundwater overdraft problems. This is a wonderful plot from a wonderful report by Claudia Font back in 2009 at USGS, showing that really most of our groundwater overdraft tends to be in the Tulare Basin. The other basins have some overdraft problems in places at times, but our major overdraft problem is the Tulare Basin. Probably 90% or more of the groundwater overdraft in California is in the Tulare Basin. And it's about 20% of the net water use in that basin. The groundwater storage has more of a quality issue to it than surface water storage, and this slide sort of highlights the nitrate contamination problems that we have with groundwater that are quite extensive, particularly in the Tulare Basin. And over time, there's the number of wells that are affected by nitrate contamination, which doesn't really affect agriculture, but it does affect human consumption, is projected to increase considerably over the coming decades. So let's get into the requirements for water storage. If you're going to store water, you have to have 5 things. First, you have to have water that's available to store. Okay. If you have a water storage project without any water, it's just an empty storage project. Second thing you need is a place to store the water, a reservoir, an aquifer, in some cases a soil column. So that's what we normally think about with reservoirs, with water storage, is reservoirs and aquifers. But having water to put in those storage places is quite important as well. And then conveyance to the storage location. As we saw on the maps early on, the water is not always available where we want it and where we want to store it. So in California in particular, we have to get water from where it is to where we want it to be, either to store it or to use it. And this becomes quite an issue in California, where most of the water is in the north and most of the empty storage capacity is way down south, pretty far down south. And then the fourth thing you have to have, and this isn't usually so important, but it is important on occasion, is you have to have an ability to get the water out of storage in order to use it. So sometimes in places, the well capacity of the region to withdraw water and make use of it during drought, say, it can be limiting. So sometimes people will store a lot of water in parts of the Tulare Basin, and then a drought comes along and they'll say, oops, we don't have enough well pumping capacity to be able to get that water out at the time that we want to use it. And then the fifth thing that we need in order to make water storage work is we have to have some coordination and knowledge to put all these pieces together. So typically the water is available from one location controlled by one water right or another. We want to store it at another place. by a different group that controls that place of storage. We have to be able to move it from where the water is to where you want the water stored. And that might be controlled by the State Water Project or the Central Valley Project in order to make that movement occur. And then the ability to withdraw that water is sometimes owned by a group of other folks. And then we have coordination not only between the different owners of the different components here, but also the regulators of water rights, groundwater basins, recharge ponds, all those kinds of things. Lack of or costs in any one of these items can prevent storage from occurring or limit the amount of storage that you can have. I think it's really important to think of water storage as involving all 5 of these components. We often hear in our public discourse just a focus on places of storage and storage capacity, but I think certainly the engineers and most folks on this call will understand that if you don't have water to put in it, and if it's in that storage is in the wrong place, you're not going to get nearly so much use out of it. Okay, so why we can't catch all this water in the wintertime? First, water is available infrequently and at the wrong places. This year, we have plenty of water, but that's not every year. Almost every year, we have some surplus water someplace, but to get for years like this are pretty unusual. New surface reservoirs in particular are costly, both in terms of finance and in terms of environmental impacts. If you're going to build a large surface water storage project and you want it to be large enough to capture all the flows available in winter, it has to be very large. But that means that reservoir is not going to be able to deliver water in very many years. It will mostly be partly empty most years. It's mostly going to be for drought storage. And so you will actually be able to make deliveries from that expensive capital facility fairly infrequently. And I'll have a slide later on that illustrates the costs of that. And then the other components and most empty aquifer storage is in the Tulare Basin. Well, one of the reasons why that aquifer storage is so empty in the Tulare Basin is that's where we've been doing the overdraft, because there's not as much surface water available there. So sometimes having available storage is an indicator that you don't have enough water coming into storage, as much as you'd like anyway. And then to get water from where it is, albeit infrequently, to where you'd like it to be, to store it, requires conveyance and diversions, which, as we've seen with the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is probably one of the biggest water sources in the state, that can have quite a lot of costs and be quite controversial at pretty much every level. And then the fifth point, I think, on why we can't catch it all is having infrequently used infrastructure really raises the water delivery costs. So the short answer to why we can't catch all the water available in wet winters is physics. There's not much water available very frequently. Economics, it costs a lot to build dedicated storage and dedicated diversions and conveyance for those unusual peaks when water is available. And then politics, because of the controversies and environmental impacts of much of this infrastructure and operation. So let's look at the economic limits a little bit. So as I mentioned before, the capital costs for a water storage project, you pay for those every year, even in years when the project is not delivering water. And the delivery benefits of that water, the economic value of having a water delivered is finite. People like to talk about how water is our most valuable resource, but it isn't really. It's most of the time it's worth a few $100s an acre foot. And this really sort of leads to one of my favorite quotes, which is, "There is rarely a shortage of water, but often a shortage of cheap water." The the graph down here on the left shows the annual cost of $1,000 capital cost increases when the recurrence of the benefits are frequent on the left and infrequent on the right. So if you have $1,000 in capital costs and at a 5% interest rate, it's pretty reasonable if every few years you get benefits from it. But if you're storing water for 10 years and then you get the benefits, then you're having to pay that capital cost for all those 10 years when no water is being delivered in order to get that delivery in an unusual year. The picture on the left is of wind turbines, and I think this illustrates a similar point. Why are we allowing all that wind energy to go to waste? Shouldn't we be building wind turbines, so that we don't waste all that energy that's just flowing across the state? Why don't we build, so many turbines that we never feel the wind because the turbines are capturing all that wind energy, almost all that wind energy. And it's because it's just not economical to do it. We don't have the frequency and the magnitudes of winds. Has to be high enough and frequent enough to justify the expense of building a turbine. And it's the same thing with capturing water as with capturing energy out of the sky. Then there are ecosystem limits to our ability to capture it all. The sort of the fish gotta swim theory. The picture of the fish there is not a delta smelt, it's a snail darter from Tennessee, which was on the endangered species list at one time, and it prevented a dam or so from being constructed in the Tennessee Valley Authority. Capturing all the water in the winter would cause some harm, quite a bit of harm to most of the ecosystems. High flows flowing out to sea even are needed occasionally in order to clear out habitats and reset them and disrupt invasive species and predators and things like that. And then also certainly the infrastructure and the operations of that infrastructure can sometimes that catch more water can also cause some environmental harm. So we also, I think, particularly with a warmer climate, we're going to see some value of storing water for ecosystems, particularly to keep cold water stored and to provide environmental flows in drier years. So I think the environmental impacts of water storage, we normally think of them as being negative, but there will certainly be increasing cases that we're going to have to consider where the stored water has environmental values, and there's several projects that are working to think about that. So if you're in favor of capturing more of this water, here are some tips for expanding water capture. Catch more, but not all of it everywhere always. And the places that are going to be the most favorable, I think, for catching more water would be to focus mostly on opportunities where the water is available frequently. So you're getting more benefits for that capital cost, more frequent benefits from the capital cost. Where storage capacity already exists. So groundwater basins that are empty are already constructed storage capacity, and that reduces the capital expense by quite a bit. And where the connections are easy, both to get water in and to get water out. It also will help, I think, capturing more water if you can find multi-benefit opportunities where there are ecosystem benefits, recreation benefits, water supply benefits, flood control benefits, all together, perhaps more integrated. Some examples, I think, of good opportunities are where we have unlined irrigation canals, where most of the time their irrigation canals are fed with surface water that leaks into becomes recharge basins, linear recharge basins, essentially, for groundwater storage. Trying to move some of our drought storage and reservoirs to aquifers, particularly with a warmer climate, that should make it easier for us to capture more of the floods and trickle them into the aquifers over time for drought storage. Water trading, water operations improvements, forecast informed reservoir operations, things like that can all be helpful ways of getting more water out of the same infrastructure or with less expensive infrastructure expansions or modifications. And then cooperation among the regulators and the owners of the different pieces of infrastructure and the different water rights is going to be important. And we're still struggling through those issues. So let's move a little bit out of the storage focus and look at the role of storage in the larger water system again. And so as we look in California to the solutions of water problems, I think it's first important to realize that there are no silver bullets. There's a lot of silver bullet vendors out there that have a single solution that they're purveying of seawater desalination or surface storage or wastewater reuse, things like that, water conservation. But really, we're moving away from that, I think, hopefully, in a big way to where we're trying to look at taking advantage of the existing system and then a portfolio approach of different supply and demand management actions that are complementary and fit well together, make better use of infrastructure and capital costs, provide opportunities for multi-agency and multi-sector benefits. We have a tremendous range of hydrology in this state. Every drought is a little bit different. Some parts are wetter than others in different droughts. And so if we have an ability to trade water, move water around, that kind of flexibility can really help both reduce the need to construct large, expensive infrastructure and reduce environmental impacts, I think, as well. We have to do these kind of portfolio approaches where you're managing supplies and demands all together in different ways, even across multiple agencies. You need to have more data, more knowledge, better modeling. And it's going to require some shifting institutional capabilities. And the last point here is we have always in California water problems that are changing in time. If you look at the water problems of 100 years ago and the water problems today, they have quite a bit in common, but they're also fundamentally different in a lot of ways. The structure of the economy has changed. The water demands that we have, the changing structure of agriculture has changed the water demands and the economic value of supplying those demands. And so sometimes we find ourselves institutionally where the institutions were structured to solve water problems as they existed 50 years ago. And we need to sort of tweak those solutions and tweak our organization of the problem so that problems can better be solved and better understood. System integration. This is a map of the Calvin model we have that was mentioned in the introduction, that has all the different storage and conveyance components and pumping and water demand components in the state. And it really shows how we have one very large network substantially, which is mostly governed locally. And it's really more than just storage and conveyance. It's got water demand management, local sources, water quality issues, treatment, pumping costs, all kinds of things that are going on. And it really gives a lot more opportunities to have very extensive, diverse, variable portfolios of activities to manage these problems and manage these problems as they vary over wet and dry conditions, and as they're going to vary even more with changes in climate. These portfolio approaches can be quite successful, and I think most of the major water agencies have tried to adopt them as much as they can. but it takes a bit more extra time to organize them and for them to be successful. When I say portfolio approach, this is the kind of activities that exist in a portfolio approach for water supply problems anyway. We have lots of different sources and conveyance and storage capacities, treatment capacities, operational strategies and rules and conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater, things like that. That's the supply side. On the demand side, we have all the water use efficiencies and water demand management things that occur in each of the sectors: agriculture, urban, and ecosystem, recreation, and the like. And then a portfolio approach that involves a lot of different people, because these water systems involve millions of people and hundreds of agencies. You need to have some incentives in this portfolio that encourages people to work well together. So pricing and markets, norming, shaming, all kinds of things like that, that we find a lot of use for. Insurance. So we have a really a tremendous toolbox, and just like when you're using a toolbox, you bring out different tools at different times for different purposes, and sometimes you have different tools working together. This is an example of San Diego, how they've been diversifying their portfolio, and have taken a very explicit portfolio-based approach to their water supplies and water management over time. And I think this is true certainly for all the major cities in the state, and increasingly for some of the agricultural areas. These portfolio activities can be at the local level as well as the state level, and both locally and statewide, we're interested in having an integrated mix of all of these activities over time, and so that they all play well together, both across agencies, across users, across individual actions. A little bit on water demands. This is one of my favorite slides from Josue Medellin at University of California, Merced, where he plotted up the total number of acres of crops in California, and he ordered them by what is the share of statewide employment and revenues that come off of these crops. And so you see that about half the acreage provides about 85 or 90% of the revenues and jobs in agriculture in the state. That implies to me, I love to see, if we have a similar plot for water use in urban areas, where half the water use in most urban areas is for landscape irrigation, which has relatively few jobs and relatively few economic importance compared to flushing toilets and industrial and commercial uses. But these kind of shapes give you some confidence that if you manage this demand side properly, you can suffer some fairly sizable water shortages without causing really grave damages to your economy, both in the agricultural sector and in the urban sector. So getting to conclusions, I like this slide. Resistance is futile if you're Star Trek fans. We're going to see some changes in California in the future. I won't read through all these, but I think these are items where it's really based on the physics and economics of the situation. No matter how much we want to not have this happen, it's going to happen. So we should prepare for that. Some things are not within our management control. And then for conclusions, California's water system was designed to capture water in wetter seasons and wetter periods for drier times, for drier years, for drier seasons. We can do a bit more of this, especially for aquifer recharge, but we're not going to be able to do all of it. So we're still going to have major water shortages, even if we capture all the economically feasible additional aquifer recharge and additional surface water storage. We're still going to have water shortage given our climate. Climate warming is going to make capturing water harder and a bit more valuable because we're going to have more of the flows are going to occur in the winter when we also have flood control concerns and less in the spring. So it's going to give us some more incentives to try to move much more of our drought storage from surface reservoirs into groundwater. There are economic and environmental limits to trying to capture all the water, even a bit more. It's important and I think feasible to capture a bit more water, but don't be greedy about it and don't have expectations that are too high, unrealistically high. And then because I'm a university professor, I'll leave you with a whole bunch of suggested readings on the subject, and I'll stop there. If there are any questions.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Jay. We have plenty of time for questions. I just want to remind you, if you still want to submit a question, send them to the email address that's provided in the chat line. So Jay, I have a bunch of questions that have come in and I will just read them to you.
Okay. This is my qualifying exam.
Yeah, right. All right, so this was from David Scott with Sun-Made Growers of California. Are there any open access water trading platforms?
Most water trading in California is done between fairly large institutions, irrigation districts and urban agencies. And so they tend not to be like Australia, which has where the more of the transactions are between individual farmers. There have been several people who have tried to come in and build trading platforms. I think there's some that people are still trying to stand up, but I'm not aware that they're being widely used, but I'm sure they're being used in a few places.
All right, this question is from Maureen Kerner here at OWP. With California's water problems, there are also funding problems to address the water problems. What are some funding solutions, current and potential?
Well, everyone would always like to have someone else pay for the solution of the problems that they're experiencing. I think that's a pretty universal basis for public finance. I tend to think that, well, just basically the roughly $40 billion a year that we spend in California on water systems, 80% of that is from local revenues, and maybe about 10% each from the state and federal budgets. So really, we have to look mostly at local beneficiaries paying for water infrastructure and water storage. So that's a good model, I think, in terms of accountability and making sure that money is well spent, because the beneficiaries will be paying for most of it. So I think you have to look at water rate for most of this. People are always proposing water bonds, but that's a fairly inefficient way to get things done. I would much prefer there to be other methods of regularly coming up with money to fund state activities.
All right, thanks, Jay. This is a question from Amy Davis-Court from HDR. Do you think that there's a role for controlled occasional flooding to mitigate CV salts? Could our focus on capturing water harm our ability to produce crops on existing farmland?
I think there's really no doubt that we're going to lose between 500,000 and maybe 1.5 million acres of irrigated agriculture, mostly in the Tulare Basin, for water supply reasons and salt balance reasons. So we're going to be struggling, I think, to figure out how to reduce the economic impact of that transition to, people that live in those basins and work in those basins. Trying to bring in alternative economic activities, or trying to make it easier for those folks to be trained up to move to other locations that have better jobs.
All right, let's see. This question is from Jeff Becko. Last year, owners complained that the California and local governments moved too slow to take advantage of the storms. What has been done to improve the speed of approval?
I think this is a very diverse state with thousands of local governments that manage water. And what impresses me when I get out in the field is this is not a new problem for most of the local governments that manage water systems. They're always very keen on trying to store as much water as they can. And so there'll be occasions where they have regulatory problems or misorganization locally. So I think for the most part, the problems they're facing are economic. It's just not worth building infrastructure to capture all that water for the infrequent opportunities when it's available. There will be some hundreds of thousands of acre feet that you can capture with a little better regulatory attention and coordination of state and local activities. But that's always going to be a struggle because every wet year is a little bit different. It's wet at a little different time of the year, a little different place. And so the challenges are always going to be moving around. So again, that coordination part of storing water is always going to be a challenge. But I know that the local folks are always scrambling, always looking for opportunities to where can I bank more water, get the water from where it's in excess to where we can hide it underground or in a reservoir someplace. They work very hard at that and pretty creatively. But sometimes it's just a lot to do in a short period of time. Sometimes the state can get out ahead of it, or the regions can get out ahead of it and have some agreements on water rights and water exchanges and conveyance capacity operations to be better, to react more quickly. So a lot of it's going to be very locally on just how prepared they are. But it's not that these people are lazy or that they're unaware on the concept here.
All right, this is a several part question from John Johnston. I'll just read it one part at a time. How does the shift of precipitation from snow to rain due to climate change affect the desirability of storage?
Well, I think it increases the value of storage because you now have more water available in the wet season and less water available in a longer dry season, because the spring becomes more of a dry season when you don't have snowpack. And so that would give you some greater value for storing water from the wet season to the dry season. The cheapest way to do that, I think in many cases, will be to move some of your drought storage from surface reservoirs into groundwater, because that way you're better utilizing existing storage capacity. The problem is that for many reservoirs, we've already built them fairly large, and to go back in and expand them gets really expensive. Not only have just things gotten more expensive in the construction field and the regulations for all of that, but also the locations of many of our reservoirs already have economically sized the reservoirs. And so if you were to expand those reservoirs, you have to do special construction, expensive construction bits like building saddle dams and things like that that raise the construction costs. And the larger you build the reservoir, the harder it is to fill it up, in general.
All right, and you've kind of touched on this one. Do we have the physical capacity and ability to store the higher runoff in aquifers?
In the Tulare Basin. So if all of our surplus water was available in the Tulare Basin, we would not have a groundwater overdraft problem down there. And we would be able to use that probably 100 million acre feet of empty groundwater storage down there to mitigate for droughts. But unfortunately, well, fortunately for us in the Sacramento Valley, most of that surplus water in the wet years is available up in the Sacramento Valley. And to get it across the Delta and down into the Tulare Basin is a real challenge, both economically, physically, and legally regulatory perspectives.
Right, and is storage in aquifers and the subsequent pumping more expensive than surface storage or not?
Well, the surface storage is more expensive to construct. If you have pump storage, you have to pay to pump the water in, but then you get a little bit of hydropower back out. But for the most part, I would say the capital cost of aquifers is very small. I mean, you might have some capital cost to increase the recharge capacity, recharge basins for it, and then you have to pay to take the water out when you pump the wells.
How much does our system of water rights interfere with efficient capture and storage?
I think in principle, it shouldn't. The problems that we're seeing, I think, are just the administration of the water rights, particularly groundwater rights. One concern that comes up with at the state board, as I understand it, is they're worried about people taking surface water with a surface water right, infiltrating it in a groundwater basin someplace else, and then using that water for some unspecified use at some unspecified place later on. It's essentially as a way of using groundwater to sort of launder the surface water rights and their restrictions on the surface water rights on place of use and time of use and purpose of use by putting it underground. So there's some concerns about that.
All right, and then final question from John. What are the biggest challenges, maybe the top three, you think we need to be addressing in the next 20 years?
Is this for storage or just the whole water problem?
I think the whole water problem.
Well, I've got 4. You get an extra bonus. There will be groundwater management, which we're getting a good start on with Sigma. I'm pretty pleased with how that's going, but it's a long road to go. Ecosystem management, where we're really doing a terrible job. I mean, we're investing a moderate amount of money, but we're not really highly organized or effective about how effective that's being, that effort is being. And it's going to become a harder challenge with climate change. So I think the hardest one is the ecosystem. A third one is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, where there's a lot going on with sea level rise and changes in ecosystems and flooding of islands and all kinds of things that are going on. It's kind of a mess in many dimensions. And then the fourth one is the rural water systems that have problems with safe drinking water. This is the nitrate contamination problem in the Tulare Basin in many rural areas. This is the problem of high groundwater drawdown during drought years, leaving households and small community well supplies stranded. Problems of the lack of economies of scale in those small systems out in rural areas, and financially keeping them viable. So those are the four big problems that I see. Most of the rest, we have problems. Everybody has problems, but in urban and most agriculture, they're pretty well organized. They're pretty well funded. And they would always like to have more money, but relative to those other four problems, I think the ecosystems, the delta, groundwater management, and small rural water systems are the biggest problems that the state really is struggling with.
All right, let's see. I have a series of questions from Kyle McNeil with the South Yuba River Citizens League. Says, Dr. Lund spoke to taking advantage of opportunities in wetter areas where these solutions are more economical and physically possible. What about areas with drier? What about areas with drier areas? How can they better solve for water problems if they are worse off geographically and would have to pay higher costs?
Well, traditionally, what the drier regions did was they tried to bring in water from wetter regions. I think we're not going to see too much expansion on that strategy. For the drier regions, what we're seeing, and I guess in some sense California as a whole is a drier region relative to most of the country. Certainly on the urban side, we're seeing declining per capita water use, which is really helping in a lot of cases. So we have a larger and larger fraction of our economy using a smaller and smaller fraction of the water. That really helps a lot. Agriculture, like I said, the drier parts of the state are going to see some losses of agricultural land. I've irrigated the agricultural land. It's a little bit of dry land farming, which is really hard to make a go of in much of the state, much of the West. Some dry land grazing, which is not nearly so valuable as irrigated crops if you had the water. More habitat development, things like that. So the drier areas are going to have to be reconciled with being dry more than they have in the past.
And a follow on was, and how does this factor into another facet of the conversation with recycling water, which would increase the value of water stored and transferred to a drier location? Well,
recycling water, in agriculture, most of the water is already recycled in the sense that the extra return flow from irrigation water applications trickles down into aquifers and becomes drought storage, or is used downstream. In urban areas, interior urban areas, those same automatic natural recycling, if you will, of water that comes out of, say, the Sacramento metropolitan areas wastewater treatment plant, it's being recycled already as delta flow into the delta, or delta exports, use down in Los Angeles when after going down the California aqueduct. So the main areas where recycled water actually produces new water is along the coasts, and particularly in Southern California, I think in the urban areas. But recycled water in the classic conversational sense that we use it, which is taking treated wastewater and treating it some more and using it in urban areas, I think we could see some more of that, but it doesn't solve the whole problem. Basically, we have probably on the order of 2 million acre-foot per year of overdraft and groundwater in the state, and maybe another 2 or 3 million acre feet more of water that we're going to lose because of climate change or wanting to dedicate more water to the native ecosystem. So that leaves us with a need to reduce water demands in many years of between 2 to 5 million acre feet. So that becomes almost 2 million acres of irrigated land, because irrigated land is 80% of human water use.
All right, and the final part of this question, and you kind of touched on it, but should dry areas focus almost exclusively on things like wastewater recycling and treatment?
Demand reduction. First of all, demand reduction, and then some whatever operational efficiencies you can get from wastewater reuse or brackish desalination or something like that. But in the drier areas, your major change is going to be reducing your water use. It'll be the demand side of the water management portfolio.
Right. Okay, another question. This is from Kevin Kasberg. Is the water rights overhaul that is being consumed in state legislature a true silver bullet? Or are we being misled by the silver bullet vendors?
Well, sometimes you have to sell the portfolio one bullet at a time. I think that most of what's being proposed is really a useful way of making the current water rights system more effective, where the accountability the accounting and the accountability are firmed up quite a bit, and the responsiveness of the water users to the water rights system is firmed up a bit. So I think that's, it's just like in an urban area. If you're out in a rural area and you're measuring your property, you're not going to be as careful as you are in the middle of a downtown area on demarcating the boundary of your land, because the land is so much more valuable in the middle of an urban area. The same is true with water in California in the West. As the value of that water increases, we're going to need to firm up the accounting and to firm up the water rights enforcement. And I think the proposals that I've seen in the legislature all seem pretty reasonable in that direction.
All right, thanks, Jay. This is a question from Dave Jones. What is meant by norming under incentives?
Oh, so in some places, particularly on electric bills, your electric bill will say, here's how much electricity you used, and here's how much your neighbors used, and here's how much houses like yours that are efficient would use. And that's meant to establish a norm for how much electricity you use or should be using, and then you can feel either proud or guilty. And so it's kind of, norming is sort of a version of shaming, a term for shaming.
Right, interesting. Another question, you mentioned in your resistance is futile slide that nitrate groundwater contamination is inevitable. Why nitrate in particular when compared to other contaminants?
Well, nitrate is kind of pernicious in that it stays underground for a long time. And it takes often decades for the nitrate, the nitrogen that's applied on the surface to percolate into the soil, be converted into nitrate, and then work its way down as essentially a vertical plume until it gets deep enough to enter a drinking water supply well. So the nitrate contaminated wells today are seeing nitrate that was applied to the fields above them some decades ago in most cases. That means even if you were to stop all nitrate new nitrate coming in, we're going to have this problem for decades into the future.
All right. Another question from Jeff Becca. What are the tech issues with storm prediction and modeling?
Well, the fundamental one is we're really never going to have weather predictions out more than, say, 10 or 11 days that are any good. Just the nature of the equations of fluid motion in the atmosphere are subject to chaos after about 10 days, 7 to 10 days. So today we have pretty good forecasts, maybe 3 to 5 days out, sometimes 7 days out. We can sort of see really big events coming. Maybe even a little bit longer than that, but you know, there's just limits to how far ahead we're going to be able to forecast. And it would be nice if we could forecast months and months out, but months and months out, our forecasts might get a little better than they are today, but they're not going to be substantially better, I think, for operational purposes, most operational purposes than what we've got today.
All right. Let's see, here's another question. Can we clean water from reservoirs and inject it directly to the aquifers so we can
Sure.
optimize the overflow of the reservoirs?
Oh, well, if you have the infrastructure to clean it, to capture it, to move it, to where you have a place to store it, and then to get it underground, you can do that. There's no engineering problem in doing this. It's just a financial problem of whether it's worthwhile, an economic problem, whether it's worthwhile. Orange County does a lot of this. They take treated wastewater, they inject it underground. Some of it they inject underground along the coast to keep as a salinity barrier. But they capture a lot of it. But they don't capture stormwater to do that. I think their stormwater capture is mostly with fairly traditional infiltration basins along the rivers.
All right, and can we capture water in the ag fields in the winter with deep ripping and cover crops so we can recharge where the rain falls?
In some times and places, yeah. In the Sacramento Valley, we probably have more capability for that. You'd have to talk to the farmers. They'll have a lot of interesting logistical issues. Sometimes they don't want their farms to be too wet, their soils to be too wet at the beginning of the planting season because they'd like the soils to be a little firmer so they can drive tractors across them. Down in the Tulare Basin and San Joaquin Basin, there tends to be not so much precipitation. So that tends to be where the storage is. That's where you'd like it. You'd like to recharge, but there's very little precipitation available to get beyond the soil zone down into the aquifer.
All right, here's a question from Dakota Keene here at OWP. The Central Valley is also a prolific petroleum and natural gas producer. Approximately 10 barrels of highly saline wastewater is produced for every barrel of oil extracted. As the American economy transfers away from petroleum dependence, how do you think the response in oil pumping and associated subsidence in the valley might offset some of our water storage quality problems?
I'm not very familiar with this, but I'll speculate on a little bit with the caveat that I could easily be wrong on some aspects of this. My understanding is that the water use for that purpose in that part of the world is about on the order of maybe 30,000 acre feet per year. And that's a basin that has a water use of about 10 million acre feet per year. So it's a fairly small amount of water. Now it can contaminate more if it's not carefully managed. My impression is that they try to deep inject a lot of that water back, but in the course of moving that kind of water around, sometimes it'll leak or spill. So it does cause can cause significant local problems, but for the larger scale regional water balance, I don't think it's a really big term.
All right, and last question, it looks like a couple of them, is from Justin Fredrickson, from the Water Environmental Policy Analyst. He said, thank you for a good webinar. He says, for a fuller picture, shouldn't the Joshu Medellin Azua graph add in economic value of much higher value dairy and livestock, beef, etc. aspects for which feed crops are just inputs?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable concern. Even with that, and those dairy feed crop things are like $9 billion of the $50 billion agricultural economy, so it's pretty sizable. I don't think all of that field crops, 50% of what I had there was field crops, but I don't think 50% of that 50% is what feeds the dairies and the beef industry so much. But then if you want to make that correction, go right ahead. But you still have a sizable amount of lower valued field crops out there.
All right, and then the final question. What also about downstreams processing jobs and other multiplier and broader economic effects of ag, particularly in ag-dominated economies?
Yeah, the Tulare Basin is about 25% of its regional GDP is agriculture, so it's pretty important down there. It's the main industry. The multiplier effects in agriculture are about the same magnitude as anywhere else in the economy. So it's kind of a wash in general. Josue Medellin's economic analyses of the last drought or so has some really nice multiplier analyses that look at those multiplier effects. But I don't think that changes the main story that I've been trying to tell here.
All right. Let's see.
Actually, you can see some of that in the reference London Al 2018, which has Josue as one of the co-authors. It's where we developed some lessons for California from the 2012 to 2016 drought.
Oh, okay. So see, Justin Justin doesn't have any more questions. He had some thoughts he shared, and I'll forward those to you,
Okay.
Jay. So that's the last of the questions. So Jay, thank you very much for answering those questions so thoroughly and spending the time to do so. On behalf of OWP and all of today's participants, we want to thank you for your presentation on a topic that really has everybody's attention these days. Again, I also want to thank all our listeners, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you all for your questions and for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks again, Jay.
All right.
Great presentation.